Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two just for other folks to log on. It seems like we already have a pretty big group, though, which is great. So just wait for a minute or two more to start. What do you think, Lisa? Should we get started?
Yeah, we might as well. It looks like we've got 61, 63. It just jumped up. 64. We've got people joining as we speak.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pandemic, Permaculture Tools and Strategies in a Time of Crisis and Possibility. Kudos to you all for making it to your computer after a sunny, super hot day like today. At least that's the current weather where I am in New Hampshire. My name's Liz Kelly, and I'm the board president of PAN, which stands for the Permaculture Association of the Northeast. We are really excited to offer this opportunity to you all tonight for a discussion about the role of permaculture during COVID-19. For those of you who don't know, PAN's mission is to increase the resilience of the Northeast region of the US by strengthening the regional permaculture network here and increasing access to education and resources in general. We are a membership nonprofit organization and work hard to serve both members and non-members in the permaculture community. We've created and stewarded free online resources for sharing information. We now offer an educational webinar series on permaculture related topics to which members get free access to all webinars. We've brought back this year the Northeast Regional Permaculture Convergence, which unfortunately had to be postponed to summer 2021. However, we are offering a virtual version of this conference during the weekend of July 24th to the 26th, 2020. So be on the lookout for details. And we're currently investing in a new membership database that will allow our members to more easily connect and share information with each other. And so we invite anyone who considers themselves to be a permaculture practitioner in the Northeast region to become a member of PAN to access these benefits and to support mutual reciprocity. Tonight's event has received so much interest, and because of that, we had to increase our Zoom webinar subscription to accommodate the number of registrants on the call, which is amazing. We're so happy about that. We'd like to invite anyone who has the ability to donate any amount to consider making a monetary contribution to PAN to help us offset the additional cost of the Zoom subscription. We've included links to the donation and membership pages of our website in the webinar follow-up email. So that is going to be very easy to find once the webinar ends. So thank you. Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Liz. Hi, everyone. We've got 77 people on the call all over Canada. We've got some folks up in Ireland, all over up and down the Northeast. And we're so thrilled to be coming to you tonight. We've got a total dream team of permaculture educators and activists and thinkers from all over the Northeast. And a couple things. We want to thank Liz Kelly and Aaron Guman, who you can't see, but he's running our tech behind the screen, and everybody at PAN for making this webinar happen. We also want to thank all of our panelists for taking time out of their busy days to join us here in this conversation tonight. And finally, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us and making this possible. So this event is recorded, so it'll be recorded tonight. You will all get a link and we will share it around so it can be accessed by a larger audience. And the way that this will run is we'll get to hear each panelist for about 10 minutes. And then at the end, we have plenty of time for a group chat. And so I invite you to ask your questions in the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end, and I'll be keeping my eye out on the chat box for that. And once again, welcome. Tonight's topic is pandemic, permaculture tools and strategies in a time of crisis and possibility. And so when the crisis surrounding COVID-19 began to spread and impact our communities, it illuminated so many already failing systems in our society. It also made visible the creative strategies that many people and networks are engaged in to stay connected, support their communities, and also to create lasting transformational change in our society and economy. For tonight's conversation, Permaculture Tools and Strategies in a Time of Crisis and Possibility, we've invited 4 activists and organizers to reflect on mutual aid, people care, and permaculture organizing in this time of COVID-19. They will share stories, tools, and strategies that people are leaning on to get through this time collectively and equitably. And they will also reflect on how we can leverage this moment to create lasting transformational change. So our guests tonight are from the Northeast Permaculture Network. We're joined from Albany, New York with Scotty Kellogg. From the Hudson River Valley, we've got Adriana Magaña. And from up in Vermont, we've got Keith Morris. And then from across the border, we welcome Bonita Ford from Canada. So we'll start out tonight's conversation with Scott Kellogg. Scott is the Educational Director at the Radix Ecological Sustainability Center, an urban environmental education nonprofit located in Albany, New York. Radix maintains a 1-acre farm that presently is focusing on supporting local food sovereignty and pandemic resilience. Scott is also the chair of the Urban Agriculture for Albany Sustainability Advisory Committee and teaches at Bard College in SUNY Albany. So thank you so much for joining us, Scott, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here tonight and being part of this awesome panel. I'm really excited. All right, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen and let's hope that that works. Slideshow from beginning. All right, everybody got that okay? Good? Everybody got that on their the full screen?
Great.
Great. All right. So yeah, like Lisa said, my name's Scott Kellogg. I am the Educational Director at the Radix Ecological Sustainability Center, which is a nonprofit organization based in Albany, New York, that maintains a demonstration site of sustainable tools and technologies that are designed to teach urban residents with a special focus on youth how to have greater local access and control over essential resources such as food and water, waste management, energy production, with a strong emphasis on designing systems that are simple and affordable, with the goal of coming up with a model that can be replicated in cities throughout countries in the world. And as we know, a huge percentage of the world's population is currently living in cities, and this trend is accelerating. So it's really important that we look at these urban environments and think about how they can be redesigned so that they're capable of providing their residents with more of their own material needs while simultaneously creating greater social justice and equity and fairness. So that's really important for the work that we're doing, is to really try and explicitly recenter the so-called social pillar of sustainability, to be really clear about how issues, related to food and micro livestock and bees and fruit trees and solar panels have relevance to low-income communities living in cities. So we do a lot of work with youth, especially with elementary school age children, but also high school age children, youth. We have been up into the beginning of the programming, running after-school programs for high school students 5 days a week, where they're coming and helping us work on the farm, and also doing a lot of environmental justice, advocacy, and education at the same time, and learning about the ways that a lot of times low-income communities of color may suffer disproportionately from exposure to toxic and polluting industries, but also becoming advocates for the equitable distribution of environmental amenities such as gardens and renewable energies and bikes, and basically saying that these are things that should be available to all residents, not just the wealthiest ones. So that's really my primary gig, is maintaining the site. We've got a 1 acre farm with chickens and ducks and aquaponics and honeybees and a whole variety of fruit trees, and growing food in about 6 or 7 other gardens all throughout the neighborhood, and really just trying to help neighbors gain access to those sites and working with youth in those programs. Like Lisa mentioned, I'm also working on a policy level in the city to some extent, or keeping foot in the world of governance. I'm also teacher at a couple of different colleges, and that's been also severely impacted by the pandemic as well. I'm mostly an advocate of experiential education and trying to design programs that get college students out of the classrooms and doing work on a ground level, and really literally getting their hands dirty to address a lot of these systemic sociological issues that they may only be studying otherwise in an intellectual context. So disasters disproportionately impact the poor, whether those are hurricanes or tsunamis or pandemics. They typically always impact lower income residents more severely. That's largely on account of the fact that they have fewer buffers to insulate themselves from economic and health shocks. We've seen this happen pretty notably with COVID, with essential workers being forced to report to work and being exposed to the disease on the front lines, to the food insecure, not having access to food or being able to afford it. A huge number of people about to begin facing evictions as states are ending their moratoriums on evictions, as well as joblessness and homelessness, where you have, or at least here in the city of Albany, people crowded into homeless shelters where there is no social distancing, so they are being disproportionately impacted, and higher infection rates among communities of color as well. Educationally, we're seeing huge impacts. The digital divide, as it's known, where low-income communities don't have necessarily access to computers or access to the internet, which is having a huge impact on kids, especially a lot of the youth in our program who have not been able to adequately attend school since all schools have gone on as well. And that's going to leave them severely disadvantaged moving forward. So these are a lot of things that we want to be thinking about, these vulnerabilities, and how we can use permaculture as a tool, as a network, as a philosophical framework to try and be addressing these. From an environmental justice perspective, the impact has been huge as well, because we've already seen communities who are already vulnerable to respiratory illnesses, particularly if they're in areas with toxic emissions and industrial pollution, being susceptible to greater levels of infection. So we've responded in a number of ways that we've been trying to, at least in the context of permaculture. I really see permaculture as a means for building equitable, just, and ecologically regenerative societies. And we've responded in really trying to tap into a lot of the existing mutual aid networks that have already been in place here. We've been doing a lot of work in hiring what are called block captains or block ambassadors, who really are going out door to door before COVID even began and reaching out to people on a one-on-one level to figure out exactly what their needs are, so that we can better be responsive to that and essentially be engaged in a listening project to know what those needs are. So, I mean, and really since COVID began, a lot of that has been assisting a lot of food pantries, honestly, who have been responding to the need of immediate food access and getting surpluses of food into the hands of hungry people, whether that's through distribution or, you know, working as a sub-distribution network with food pantries to access food that otherwise might go to spoil, and getting that into the hands of hungry people in a lot of different ways. So actually, I'm just going to jump ahead here. Yeah, I mean, this is just some of the surpluses that we've been seeing, just huge stacks of strawberries, which brings you to tears when you think about the volumes of food that are going to waste around the country as a whole. I mean, I've been hearing huge stories of people just dumping thousands of gallons of milk and smashing eggs, and what's happening in the meat packing plants is ridiculous too. And that really shows us how vulnerable our food system as a whole is, and how it's not very good at speeding up or slowing down quickly to meet shifting demand. And I'm hoping really that that's one of the takeaways that we walk away with when we begin to think about rebuilding and redesign, is to be able to critique our food system in that way. So on a very local level, we've been advocating for the construction of what we call pandemic resilience gardens, which are built off of a similar idea to the Victory Gardens of World War I and World War II, which were designed to give people greater control over the food system, but also a feeling of control over their lives in general, a feeling of security. I think it's really important for people just to be able to get outside, to stay busy, to put their hands in the dirt is so much better than staying indoors and being in a sea of anxiety, which is just a recipe for mental health disaster, which we see unfolding in front of us. And that's a whole other component of COVID that we've really yet to realize the full impact of. So really providing support for people to make gardens in whatever space they have access to, whether that is a vacant lot, whether it's a backyard, whether it's a windowsill, whether it's a stoop. In urban areas, it's typical for people to not have access to large amount of space. So we have to work many times on really a micro scale with whatever spaces it is they do have access to. So we've been doing soil testing. We were, before the pandemic came on, able to purchase a device called an XRF that can test up and down the periodic table. So we're able to do free lead screening, which is important in urban environments. Been trying to provide soil to different communities, which is in short supply, working with the city of Albany, who normally distributes soil for free. I mean, they're really strapped themselves. Their whole Department of General Services workforce has been cut dramatically, so they haven't been able to provide these services. So really going and loading it up by hand and working as a sub-distribution network. Planting seeds, we got a huge donation of seeds this fall that we've been just trying to get out there, which is great because who knew that there was going to be a run on seeds. And a lot of that I think is fueled by fear and panic buying, which is unfortunate. Same thing with chickens. But, you know, and that's one thing that we want to be careful with messaging, is not triggering fear within people, because when they're afraid, they make irrational decisions, selfish and irrational decisions that aren't benefiting the collective good. So trying to manage that sense of urgency and fear at the same time, but doing a lot of bucket gardens, really. This is one of the biggest things we've been doing lately, something as simple as this, getting 5-gallon buckets, drilling holes in them so they drain, and filling them with soil, and distributing them with starts throughout the communities and throughout the neighborhoods so people have greater access to food. So really, I only got a minute left, but in closing, want to emphasize one of the most inspiring voices I've been listening to through the COVID pandemic is that of Naomi Klein and her whole idea of the shock doctrine. And she's come up with a fantastic video called Coronavirus Capitalism, where she will talk about how disasters of all sort, crises there's an opportunity in crisis. They shake up the established system and create paradigm shifts. In as much as that, we have the opportunity to implement new ideas. A lot of times ideas that previously were seen as being too radical. These can either be regressive ideas that support corporate control and austerity, or they can be progressive ideas that promote the greater social welfare. That really comes down to who among us is willing to fight hardest for them. A good example of this is basically just the onlining of education. Bill Gates saying, why would we ever go back to school? This is a really terrifying idea to me. As a teacher, as an educator, all I can say is Zoom. I mean, it's what we have to work with right now, and it's better than nothing, but it's an incredibly poor surrogate for face-to-face, person-to-person connection that can never be replaced through, I believe, a technological platform. Yeah, opportunity in crisis, and everybody stay strong and hopeful. And thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Scotty. Excellent. So we've got up next is still in the state of New York, Adriana Magaña. And Adriana is a drummer, a permaculture designer, visionary, and eternal student of the natural world. She lives in the Hudson Valley with her partner, Andrew Faust, and daughter, Juniper, where they operate the Center for Bioregional Living, a permaculture education, design, and consulting organization. She believes that an education founded in the patterns and practices of nature will help people understand their connection to place within the natural world, and works to facilitate and teach these skills to all that want to learn. So welcome, Adriana. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for organizing this, Lisa, and thank you to all panelists and everybody behind the scenes doing this work. Thank you, Liz, as well. Scotty, you just said it all. What else is there to say? And Scotty, I met Scotty at Bennington College when I was playing drums in a band called Crash Worship. And I think maybe, it was Amherst, sorry, excuse me. It was all a blur of like Northeastern colleges. Yeah, and so we met in 1992, I think it was. And yeah, I can still picture you, blonde, long hair. And then after I took my permaculture design course with Andrew at Years Tomorrow, I wound up taking Scotty's Radix training. And we had communicated a little bit before that and realized that we had actually met before. And so that was really inspiring. And so, you know, I've always been interested in like, whether it be through music or whether it be through the work that I'm doing now in permaculture and teaching and building a lot of gardens. I've always been interested in kind of walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And that has to do with what brings me total joy. And I think in this, when we, as Scotty said, you know, this, and, you know, reflecting on Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, you know, this whole opening that we have right now through this crisis, there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of joy to be had here. I know we really, I really went through a lot of different emotions when this whole thing kicked off, a lot of deep discussions. And I don't, you know, I just want people to know that you're not alone, and we can talk about all these solutions, and we can talk about all of these things that are really positive that we could be stepping towards and be moving into, but there's also like a lot of suffering and a lot of like reckoning with like just being in that suffering and in that pain, and of course trying to do what we can about it. But the solutions have been the same, really as simple or sophisticated as you want them to be. But you know, we keep as a culture glossing over the foundational issues, and we keep getting distracted by you know, information, by, you know, Neil Postman, who is a media theorist. He's long gone now, but taught at NYU, wrote a book called Distracting Ourselves or Amusing Ourselves to Death. And there is this real, I mean, I really think it's American culture in a nutshell, how we are like the entertainment capital of the world, right? That's what we sell. We sell weapons and entertainment. And we tend to tune out from these very relevant issues of our that are happening to our lives. And I would say ostensibly it's very hard for just a, you know, average person, not somebody who's, you know, reading permaculture books or engaging in, you know, wondering where their food comes from. But it's really hard for the average person to really understand the connections that their choices have to the systems that are basically wreaking havoc on our health, on our planet. And so my interest is to try and connect those dots a little bit for people. Of course, teaching people, we have, hundreds of students. We're doing an online course right now. People are more engaged than ever to really take this time of isolation to tune in and learn what they can about permaculture design and the natural world and systems and patterns found in nature. So I'm taking a lot of solace from that. And we are also, allowing people to come up here, volunteer time, we're keeping social distancing or whatever, just inviting a few people up at a time to try and really, honor all of that. But it's super important for people to get out into the natural world. And I agree with Scotty, like the whole idea of our education getting any more technocratic is a failure. It's an absolute failure. We should actually be moving in the opposite direction. And, this is a real interesting lens that we have here, because this pandemic is not just happening in America. It's happening over the entire world. And no matter what the rhetoric or dogma is from the less generative, less imaginative side of the aisle, I would say that, all of the different choices that countries are making by the way that they're addressing this, by the way that they're taking care of their people, this is a real wake-up call for people. And, sometimes it does take this kind of shredding of the Wizard of Oz's curtains, to like fully expose the crisis that has been going on. If we we could all be listening to people of color for however, since slavery, that these conditions have always existed in America. We have a mythology of American exceptionalism. We have this whole mythology of individualism, and it's just a thin veneer that's keeping those things intact. The media and like these talking heads, and frankly, like since the growing season started, I just have just been in the garden the whole time, and I've just taken a huge news break. I ran for office last year. I was really involved in politics. I still am, but that I just needed to have a little gap, and I would encourage anybody who's checking the news all the time, just like give yourself some space. Give yourself some space it's going to be there when you get back. It's just like a soap opera. There's terrible things happening all the time, and maybe take that time that you would be spending online or on social media, take it and try and volunteer if you can, if you're able to do that in person, if you're only able to do that remotely. There have been a lot of different things in Ulster County where people can actually, they're asking for people to answer phones. There's a whole hotline for people to call and get help and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, and we live in an area that is very food insecure. That's a political speak for hunger and starvation. We also live in an area that is very rural, and people don't have adequate transportation. And, what Scotty was saying with regards to people in urban areas, oftentimes don't have access to a space to grow food and all of these other things. Sometimes in the country, it's like that as well. People need, they're either renting. This area is particularly impoverished, but they're either renting or they don't have money for tools. And so I'm I have volunteered at our local food pantry, which serves 250 families regularly, and that's more than doubled since this crisis happened. And there's a garden there that we started bringing in last year, and we're growing out starts, and so we're going to be planting stuff there. But, you know, I'm on call. If anybody wants help with their garden, if anybody, you know, needs starts or anything like that, we have a whole group of people who are providing things like that in the Hudson Valley, a number of farms and things. So, but I really love the, I really don't want to, I'm very hopeful about the opportunities, and I'm also slightly pessimistic because when I see other countries taking it to the streets, like France's yellow vests and things like that, Podemos, and I'm wondering how that happens here in America. And I'm wondering how that happens here with lockdown. One of the biggest opportunities that we've seen is just not buying anything, right? Our ability to absolutely strangle Amazon is through our lack of participation in creating the next trillionaire, or the first trillionaire, or whatever his glorious title is. But we have that ability to do that, and we can. So let me see my notes here if I have anything else. I would also like to say that, you know, this pandemic isn't a unique or new thing. Pandemics have been happening in the world for ever since humans and animals started living in really close confines. And when we trace the connection of COVID to the multinational corporation, CAFO food system, we can see the connections there. Time and time again, this system is responsible for numerous influenza outbreaks, all these different strains, all of these new kinds of bizarre pathogens that are coming out of these barbaric, truly barbaric practices. And what I like about permaculture, and what I continue to come back to with permaculture, is the grounding ethics: earth care, people care, fair share. So much so that I used it. That was my political platform. It's just my platform for life. We cannot make a healthy world or a healthy human when we have animals that are held in these barbaric practices. And I would like to say also that our ability to desensitize ourselves to these things that are going on in our world is a result of our further and further divide with the natural world.
Adriana, I just wanted to let you know that you have 1 minute.
Great. So having said that, deepening our connection to the natural world and really setting our sights on the world that we know is possible, our wildest dreams. We need everyone's wildest dreams. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adriana. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist. Our next panelist is Keith Morris of Prospect Rock Permaculture. Keith has been applying his lifelong love of nature and culture and experience as an activist to promote an ecological design since 1996. Since 2000, he has worked professionally as a designer, builder, and grower of ecologically regenerative, socially just, and culturally appropriate whole systems in cities and countrysides around the world. So thank you so much, Keith, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it's really an honor to be on this panel. It's such a crucial conversation. I think all of us recognize, you know, in crisis is opportunity. And this has been such a unique crisis, I think, for many of us, you know, who've been working in these fields and essentially anticipating collapse for decades. It's not unfolding in ways unlike we imagined, and in other ways entirely unlike we imagined. And I guess maybe before I get into it, I'll just share a little bit more about like what I do, what I'm doing at the moment in regards to that first question. Let's see if I can screen share here. Excuse me a second. So yeah, we'll go with this one. And sorry, folks, technical challenges here. Let's see, does this work for screen share, or is it all covered with Zoom stuff? It doesn't have Zoom stuff in front of it for you?
Looks good.
Okay, it does for me. So this Willow Crossing farm, this is really the centerpiece of my work. It's a farm that I started actually at age 21, and since then it's been an entirely debt-free and budgetless farm in that we've never borrowed any money. We didn't start with any money. We've never taken any loans, although that's not entirely true. We've financed vehicles and have worked with the Farm Service Agency, but we didn't go to a bank to buy a farm. And frankly, I wouldn't have been able to. So from the outset, it's kind of been a sweat equity experimentation and experimentation in ecologic regeneration. The farm is, the majority of the farm is floodplain. You know, on the one hand, maybe the foolish move of a 21-year-old starting a farm, and on the other hand, you know, some of the best soils that we have in rocky, mountainous Vermont. Essentially at its core, we're really a tree crops experimentation farm. The experimentation with tree crops has really led into nursery, a tree crops nursery, an agroforestry nursery. And essentially that's my business, and that's what I'm doing these days. We try to avoid plastic pots and watering nursery plants all summer. So we do almost entirely bare root plant sales in the very early spring, late April, early May. And it's just an incredible outlet for really great genetics that are underrepresented in Vermont, from chestnuts, walnuts, hazelnuts, pine nuts, butternuts, heart nuts, and more, you know, and currants, gooseberries, kiwis, plums, apples, cherries, pears. We're doing lemons, figs, CBD hemp, and other medicinal herbs. And we just meet so many different people that I might not otherwise in, and also share a lot of information. I mean, almost everyone we're dealing with, you know, looking through our kind of menu, so to speak, says you can grow kiwis in Vermont. We didn't know that you could grow any nuts, much less over 3 dozen species of nuts. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but I just kind of put you in context of what we're doing and what we're doing every day. And not to, you know, not that I necessarily want tons of people rushing into, you know, the niches that we've explored. Honestly, the nursery business is really crucial. Mostly stuff is being mailed in from the West Coast or points south. So for those of us in the Northeast, to start really exploring, you know, our local provenance, our local genetics, our local potential for tree crops, we really have a very our landscape, you know, historically was managed with tree crops as a centerpiece of human sustenance, and clearly wants to return in that direction of a forest. So using that permaculture principle of, you know, directing and steering succession, we can really kind of cast a sail and move with the ecologic wind rather than motoring against it. And we see major opportunities, even within existing models of annual agriculture and grazing, et cetera, for shelter breaks and wind breaks, shelter belts, wind breaks, riparian buffers, living fences, and all of that. So just to kind of place myself with where I'm coming from and what we're doing these days, we have seen a major surge in interest in people, you know, planting, you know, of course, the standards like strawberries and asparagus, but also gooseberries and currants and ribes and these relatively easy to grow, tolerant of a wide variety of condition type plants. Also, for those of you who are kind of, you know, potentially, you know, we hear very often that, you know, people interested in permaculture feel like they need to own land, or they need access to land. And obviously that's a major issue that we societally need to deal with. but propagating plants really doesn't take a tremendous amount of space. And in fact, you know, in my cooler, I have a chest freezer type situation. There's over 600 bare root plants, you know, crammed in there in one chest freezer. And when it comes to, you know, grafting and seeding and all these things where we're moving the plants around, we don't need that type of long-term relationship. So for, you know, those exploring the potential of renters permaculture, or those just pursuing that dream of, you know, someday having their spot to plant this stuff, you can save literally tens of thousands of dollars by propagating your own plants, by collecting sign wood, by grafting, and just building these skills and building this experience. So I share that as just one thing. I think everybody, you know, I think all people are inherently biophilic, in love with nature, and we do find these deep relationships with the species that we depend on, especially when we eat them and they nourish us in return. But not only those, you know, as we see in the case of pets and things like that, but that obviously extends to the world of plants, and we have so many plants that we can, you know, care for and be cared for in return. So given that context, you know, I think, you know, where we are right now is, you know, how do we navigate this really unique situation where this collapse that some of us have been anticipating is happening in the midst of record low fuel costs, which I think, you know, 10, 15 years ago, everyone was arguing, you know, that was going to be the real tipping point to societal collapse and food system collapse, was going to be the cost of energy. And already, you know, Scotty and Adriana have both mentioned Naomi Klein. I'm a big fan of her work, and I think it's so important what she's saying, because a lot of us have underestimated the resilience of these unsustainable systems, and the resilience of capital, or the resilience of the status quo, or the resilience of those in power, and the resilience of financial systems to not only survive, but take advantage continually, whatever unfolding disasters, to their advantage. And we've seen that with Katrina, we've seen that with Sandy, we've seen that here with COVID. In fact, Naomi Klein has coined, I believe it's her who's coined the phrase, the Screen New Deal. And I find it's ironic, of course, to be engaging in this platform and celebrating our interconnectivity and this global reach and our conversations and our ability to communicate. At the same time, we really need to pay attention and balance that with just the incredible increase in reach and power of these major technical corporations. And when we look at our emotional landscapes and we start thinking about that information ecology from the permaculture perspective, we are, on the one hand, engaging in more dialogue, engaging in more, you know, collaborative. We aren't just passively consuming as we might in front of the television, but on the other hand, it's nothing compared to our unmediated connection to each other, or unmediated connection to nature and ecology. I've struggled for years with.
You have 1 minute, Keith, just to let you know.
1 minute. Okay, sorry, I had so much. Oh my God, I very poorly managed my time. I apologize. So, in that sense, when we look at this new world and this potential for homeschool, where we're essentially mandating screen time, it's frankly pretty scary. And I'm not going to use this time or opportunity to get into potential, you know, security issues or problems with like any of these individual platforms, but how do we continue to both make use of what we have as resources at present with global information technology, with global economic systems, to give birth to something completely different? What pieces do we want to hold on to? What pieces do we want to get rid of? When we look at this basic resilience, I'm going to pull up a few slides here that came from Permaculture, Permacore International, which was something informal where permaculturalists were responding to disaster, formalized for the earthquakes in Haiti, where we looked at the very basics of food, water, shelter, energy, and how those connected. And when we look at how these things radiate out, we can see these, you know, pieces where we're lacking completely, where we really don't, even prior to crisis, when we have people without adequate shelter, without food security, without access to drinking water, without the resources or knowledge to deal with human wastes intentionally. So much there. I want to wrap and not take too much time. I had so much more that I wanted to say. I guess what I'm worried about is this digital reality. So I hope that all of us in this, you know, take this to our communities with appropriate distancing, but, you know, do this work face to face, do this work engaged with plants and animals, or just plants, as the case may be, but get our hands on and get and look to how we build these teams in our communities. I don't think, you know, it's more important. I don't think there's anything that's more important than, you know, this simple act of neighborliness, to look at like a quote of Bill McKibben's. I have something else to say, but I'm going to yield my time and we'll see if there's more later.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Keith, for that. And would you mind unsharing your screen, Keith, for a moment?
Yes.
Excellent.
Back to, did that already happen?
Yes, thank you so much. So up next, our final panelist is Bonita Ford. Bonita is the author of Embers of Hope, Embracing Life in an Age of Ecological Destruction and Climate Crisis. She gives courses and workshops in permaculture, nonviolent communication, Reiki, and gardening. Bonita has led groups around the world for over 18 years. And to learn more about Bonita and her work, you can visit livingearth.net. So thank you so much, Bonita, for being with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just enjoying seeing all these faces here and all these names in the chat box. So thank you, Lisa and Liz and Aaron and Pan and all of the panelists and everyone that's joined us tonight. And I want to start just by acknowledging the land where I am. So the place that I call home is unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And that's important to me because for, I think, many of you, those especially who have access to gardens and those of you who love green things and who love growing, for me, the garden, our garden, has been the center of my life for the last decade. And I didn't expect to be able to be more grateful for this land or to be more grateful for our garden. And with the lockdowns this spring, I have been incredibly so. It's just to be able to be outside and to have my hands in the soil and to really have this sense of connection to the life around me, even though I could only talk to my neighbors through the hedge and text people and call out to people from down the street. The garden is still the center of my life. It's still the hearth of my life, which reminds me that our website is actual living hearth and not just earth, because it includes both our hearts and our Mother Earth. So I want to start from there. And for me, I would say that what I've found really interesting is that with the pandemic, I think that it's really begun to normalize some of the ideas and perspectives and concerns that I have, that my partner and I have about our society, about our world. And what I mean by that is that my partner and I, we grow a lot of our own food. We live very simply. We don't have a lot of money. We are at home a lot of the time. Our hands are dirty, our knees are dirty. And for a lot of the people, well, for some of the people around us, be they family or neighbors, the way we live and the choices that we made are kind of weird. They're maybe a little bit quaint, maybe they're a little bit hippie, they're a little bit tree huggerish. And what I found is that with the pandemic right now, I've been able to have conversations that I wasn't able to have with people before. And so I'm sensing an opening that wasn't there before. And a number of the other speakers have already touched upon this. And I think what I want to do, also kind of the benefit of being the last person speaking, I kind of get to echo back and weave together some of the threads from the other panelists. And so I just want to echo back some of the things that other folks have said. So Scotty mentioned just working with people and what they have access to, acknowledging the urgency and fear that is up for a lot of people. Adriana, you mentioned that just the opportunity for a lot of joy right now. And Keith, you talked about anticipating collapse, and some of us have been anticipating that for a long time. And for me, I'm really appreciating this time because, so the rush on seeds and the shortage of seeds, just as a very simple example, there are people around us that are interested in growing food who weren't last year, who weren't last decade. And it's not a hippie tree hugger thing anymore. It's not a permaculture thing anymore. It's a human thing. It's something about being alive. And so for me, I think part of what the pandemic has brought home is that there is a real threat to the way that we are living as a society, the way we are living as a civilization. And I think it's also really made real that we need one another. We need our communities, and our communities are part of our support system, are part of our emotional and mental well-being, and they're a part of our physical well-being as well. And for those of you who are not familiar with permaculture, or maybe who are only starting, so this word includes both permanent agriculture as well as permanent culture. And I've heard a number of permaculture teachers say that even with a well-designed system, even with a well-designed ecological system, if the social systems that are connected to that, if those systems fall apart, then that landscape, that forest can become a pile of lumber or a pile of matchsticks. So for me, all of this goes hand in hand. It's about, as Adriana mentioned, the ethics of permaculture really being core or really being foundational. So earth care and people care. And I think that is so important in what we're talking about. And so for myself, I've been working on a book for the last 6.5 years, and that is it'll be available in a few weeks. So I'm pretty excited about that. The pandemic hasn't, in some ways, changed a lot about the way my day-to-day life has looked in the last few months. I've been still at my computer working on the book, so it's been a great excuse to not be very social. And the book is called Embers of Hope: Embracing Life in an Age of Ecological Destruction and Climate Chaos. And it's about confronting our mortality. It's about confronting the climate crisis. And it's about asking ourselves, how do we really want to live? How can we live and create more meaning? How can we create more happiness while taking better care of all of the life around us? How can we be more fulfilled as human beings while taking care of our responsibilities to Mother Earth, while taking better care of our communities? And so for me, this book, it's really about trying to balance hope and despair. And I think these are very natural feelings and emotions, and I think a lot of people are experiencing that right now. Just echoing back what Scotty had said just about the urgency and the fear, I do think that it is, so right now with the COVID crisis and with the climate crisis, for me, it's about learning to face the urgency. It is about owning up to our fear. It's about taking responsibility for that, and also connecting with our love, connecting with our commitment, and taking action. And so it's about all of those things together. And I think, to me, that's what I hope, that those are the seeds that I hope Embers of Hope can offer to people in this community, to people that I've never met. It's really about, facing painful realities, facing what's challenging, trying to take responsibility for that, looking at the opportunities for the choices that we have in our own lives, whether that be starting a farm or saving seeds or giving seedlings to our neighbors or learning to garden for the first time, or or helping an elderly neighbor do their groceries, or checking in on someone who is ill and at home. It could be anything. It doesn't mean that we all have to be gardeners. We each have our own gifts and strengths. And so for me, what I'm working on right now, and what I'm trying to bring to the world through my book, Embers of Hope, it's about this, I think the core root in the book is about the potential of small forces to transform our world. So just asking each of us, inviting each of us to look for the leverage points in our own lives. Are you already a farmer? Are you an educator? Are you a parent? Are you a writer? Are you a filmmaker? Are you an artist? Are you a visual, colorful, I don't know, vocal creator? What are your passions? What are your strengths? And for me, those are some of the opportunities that I look to. You know, a number of the speakers this evening have spoken about just this connection between crisis and opportunity. And oh, actually, I forgot that I had some photos that I wanted to share with you. So I'll keep speaking, and then I'll flip through some of the photos. So this piece about crisis and opportunity, I think that a lot of strangers and neighbors and people that I don't know, I think a lot of them need kindness, and I think they equally need to have the ability to contribute. And I'm not saying that everyone will resonate on that level, and I'm saying that I think a lot of people do. And so just one very simple example, in this last couple of months, my partner and I, we both got a bit sick. And so we were told by healthcare workers to isolate for 14 days. And I was really surprised, and I was really, really touched that our neighbors checked in on us. And these are not neighbors that we're particularly close with. And so neighbors came and brought cookies, and neighbors came and brought maple syrup, and a neighbor texted to ask if we needed groceries. And it just reminded me that, so I remember I loved Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell. And in that book, she talks about how it's most, in times of crisis, it's most likely the people who are in our immediate vicinity who will be able to offer help and be able to be of assistance to us first. And so for me, the seeds that we've been sowing for years have been about building relationship with neighbors. We live in, so the place that we live in, we live on 1/5 of an acre. It's kind of, well, depending on where you are, kind of small, kind of large. It's a suburban sized lot. And we have neighbors on all sides of us, and we're not in an intentional community. And our lot looks very, very different from the lawns around us. And so we've tried to be friendly with people and say hello to people and bring them garlic and bring them green onions and bring them tomatoes. And over the years, some of the weirdness about that strange hippie couple with that kind of wild looking garden has turned into hellos, and has turned into how are you, and has turned into conversation. And so for me, really,
just to let you know.
Thank you. So for me, I think ultimately the leverage point is about building community, because I really think that what this crisis is showing us is how vulnerable we all are. And I think it goes back to what Keith was saying. We're not just anticipating some sort of collapse in the future. I think average people who were not tuned in or dialed into this before are waking up, they're listening, they're concerned. And I think now is the time for us to be starting more conversations with neighbors and checking in more with neighbors, and to be starting to build relationships where there are fences around us. And so I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, to be thinking about all of these things, because, and I think maybe that's part of my work and my calling with Embers of Hope, is that there is potential in our fear, there is potential in our anxiety, there is potential in our sense of scarcity, because behind all of that is this sense of how deep our care is, how deep our need for interconnection is, how deep our need for mutual support is. And so I would invite all of us to really to allow ourselves this space and time, not only to be reflecting on all that is broken in our world, but to also acknowledge the challenging and painful emotions that we're facing right now, individually, collectively, and have those kind of be part of the driving force for each of us in choosing, how do we want to live a little bit differently or a lot differently going forward, and how do we do that on our own? How do we do that with our families? And how do we do that together? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonita.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So we've got about 25 minutes left in our question and answer period. So if you're out there, I know that Erin's been helping us collect questions in the chat box, but feel free to chime in if you have a question for any of the panelists or collectively, and we'll give some time to that. So you can put it, I'm seeing there's a question. Okay. All right, there's some people asking, if the social culture isn't dedicated to permanent culture, our agroforests can become a load of matches. There we go. And we see, there's another question about hyperlocal peer education in these times to address permaculture and food security. What sort of each one teach one idea with developed materials like the Black Panthers? Thoughts on that, what that might look like, transition initiative adapted to cities and towns.
Do you want us to answer these or talk about these? Or
yeah, go ahead if you have any thoughts on that.
I would like to recommend that people engage with their local newspaper if you're blessed enough to have one. If you don't, write letters to whatever the closest thing is to that. Write letters to the editor. People need education. They need education about the potential for agroforestry, for crop as woodlot management. We could be growing wood in a whole different way here in the Northeast. We could be, you know, raising livestock and all of these really generative ways that would obviously take the pressure off of this single idea that people have that this is, you know, CAFO feedlots and all these, you know, torture beat kind of situations are the way to raise animals. And I bring that up obviously because they're a hotbed for disease and contamination, right? Just, you know, obviously because of how the animals are kept. But there's a lot of potential to educate people right now. Another thing that I'm involved with is the climate smart communities. I think it might be a nationwide program. You can see if your community is a climate smart community. There's a whole checklist. I was kind of skeptical when I got involved. You know, sometimes bureaucracy can be a little contrived, a little bit, but they really actually thought about a lot of these questions. And one of the things that I would like to see municipalities take up is knowing that greenhouse gases, knowing that carbon, knowing that buildings are one of our greatest, you know, ways that carbon enters the atmosphere because they're so inefficient and built poorly. We need to have another standard for building codes. And so that the other standard of building codes would take into consideration using coppice woodlot agroforestry products. You know, it's all connected. There's a whole web of influence and interaction and local economy in, you know, infusion and jobs for people and things like that. So there's a lot of information out there that people don't know about. There's a lot that people need to learn about, and now's the time.
Excellent, thanks, Adriana. Any other responses either to what any of the panelists have said or any of the questions that I rose earlier? There's a couple more questions about what the role of the permaculture network is now. How do we expand and strengthen network? And how do we refocus dialogue on foundational issues?
Can I take, I don't know that you read this one, Lisa, that there's a question about edges and emergent properties. May I just take that question?
Go for it.
All right. And so I was also just reminded that there were a couple of photos that I wanted to share. So I'm going to use this opportunity to do that real quick as well. So the one thing that I really wanted to mention was just in terms of edges and emergent properties. So this photo is of an action that we participated in that was organized by Extinction Rebellion Ottawa. And so this was an occupation. So already Ottawa, the city, it is occupied by settler people. So it is unceded Algonquin territory. So it was reoccupied by allies and activists as part of this action. And there were a couple of things that I just wanted to point out from this image. So one thing, the man on the left, he's holding a little sign that says 164 defenders were killed in 2018. So land defenders, water defenders, that was the statistic that they had brought, and they were doing a small ritual to honor some of the people who have given their lives in an attempt to try and protect the land and the waters where they live. And what I want to point out is that, so to me, the climate crisis is a very urgent issue. And when you look at this photo, this is not masses of people. You know, we were a small crowd occupying a bridge, reoccupying a bridge, or reoccupying a bridge on occupied territory. And I think what the pandemic has raised is that actually so many more of us are affected by this. So it's not just, it's somehow normalized this idea that there's this threat to life out there. And it's making more people, it's more than 164 people who have lost their lives to this. And I don't want to get into the stats of what this pandemic is like compared to other diseases or other social crises, because that could be another long conversation. And it's just to say that I think to me, what it points out, and part of that edge is that I think this pandemic makes more of us perhaps be a little bit more willing to come out of the closet as activists. That it's not just some marginal tree-hugging people that are concerned about this, but there are larger structural issues that affect us the world over, that are affecting the way many of us live, and that we can't sustain this. We can't keep living and hope to have our children or our nieces and nephews have a good life. Even within my lifetime, I'm not sure what I'm going to see, because I didn't expect to see this in my lifetime. Even though I have been anticipating collapse, I didn't really expect this. So I think, for me, when I think of emergent properties, at least, or one edge, I think about the connections between everyday people who didn't think of themselves as activists, as organizers, as environmentalists, people who are concerned right now just about food, people who are concerned about their communities, people who are concerned about their jobs. Those were not edges that we really had a lot of overlap with before, or maybe not as in such an obvious way. And so I think, and one of the emergent properties is, I think it's making more average people explore these questions of how fragile, how vulnerable are we all, are many of us, most of us. So yeah, I wanted to point that out and to share that, and maybe to have people think about that from that perspective, that maybe it puts more of us, or potentially all of us, in the same boat, because it's not just up to a few of us to fix this now. Thank you.
Can I add one more thing? Do we have time? So one thing that's been interesting to me about the pandemic is that we are seeing certain metrics, certain aims of environmental activists being achieved in terms of reduction of pollution, reduction of greenhouse gases. You hear these stories of non-humans moving into human spaces. I mean, just yesterday there was a turkey in the lot next to my house in downtown Albany. That kind of blew my mind. So on the surface, it can appear like these are gains, that these are wins for the environmental movement. But I really want to point out, this isn't the way that we want to do it. This is not just transition. Really, the way that we want to do it is where it's participatory, where it's equitable, where everybody has a say in how it's happening, and it needs to be planned and designed, not like this. And I think as the permaculture community, one really important thing that we can do is push back on this emerging, I sort of call it environmental misanthropicism, where you sort of seen this. I mean, there's stories of actually Extinction Rebellion getting their posters hijacked by certain right-wing groups that say things like, oh, humanity is the virus and coronavirus is the cure. We really want to push back on that type of thinking, which demonizes humans. And I remember just Keith and I used to co-teach a lot, and one of the important takeaway from that for me is where he sort of talks about being a post-Earth Day child, where you're sort of raised to believe that humans are inherently bad, evil creatures, and sort of the best that we can do is to consume less and take ourselves out of the picture. But as permaculturists, we know that's not true, that there are many historical examples of human societies living in the same places for centuries and actually having a regenerative impact on the health of soils, on the quality of water, on actually increasing biodiversity, and making sure that that narrative gets pushed to the forefront to, like Adriana saying, close the gap between nature-society dualism. And an author that's been really inspiring to me, I've read in the past year, is a guy named Charles Eisenstein. He's actually a mathematician, but he wrote this book that's called Climate: A New Story, and talks about this idea of what he calls sort of carbon fundamentalism, where in the climate change movement, there's a tendency to reduce everything to greenhouse gases. And that if we can achieve those particular metrics, we can solve the problem. And it really loses sight of the big picture, of the fact that social injustice and ecological degradation have at their core the same root issues, the same root problems, and we cannot address one without the other. So as permaculturists, I think we take a very good whole systems, complex systems view of things, and we need to keep that centered and explicit.
Excellent. Thanks, Scotty. So we've got just 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering if other panelists, I know that you all had some more to say. So if you'd like to either respond to any of the questions or some of the questions that were asked in the Q&A, feel free to chime in.
I'll jump in if I may. Just in response to that, Scotty, yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's a part of the incredible beauty of the climate change movement, but also one of its challenges is seeing that as like a singular objective. It was over 7 years ago that David Holmgren wrote a very controversial article called Crash on Demand, and I'll post a link in here or somehow to the page group or something, so folks can check it out if they want. But essentially, it was making the argument that we need to use design, and specifically by that I mean intention, towards a world with, in David Holmgren's language, population descent and energy consumption descent. Now, especially when we start throwing around phrases like population descent, it gets really scary when we look at the inequity of power and distribution and who's making these decisions, or, designing genetically engineered, birth control food or whatever nightmare situation emerges. And I think, that's where design comes in, is how do we parachute this? How do we really, learn how to create the most resilient systems, not for ourselves as individuals, and not only for our communities, but especially for our society's most vulnerable and those who are already insecure. and keep those threads with us, and not see this as a win. You know, that phrase, humanity is the virus, I think is really problematic when we look at the impacts of this disease in particular, and how inequitably its consequences are playing out. But when we see things like factory farms closing, you know, this is what many of us have wanted for decades and have worked for decades. Now, that doesn't mean we want to see people starve because of it. It doesn't mean that we want people to lose their livelihoods who may have had that for their jobs. So how do we navigate these, you know, with as much intention as possible, and with as much of our fair share ethic as possible? And really, that's a question maybe to our other panelists, or to everybody, because I think we can all participate in that in our own ways. But it's really important that we put it in that context of dissent by design. And you know, as we're inevitably writing, you know, this is obviously one of many. You know, when we look at climate disaster, when we look at disease, when we look at food insecurity, when we look at, you know, energy futures, we're in for a bumpy ride, and we know that. So how do we keep this goal of more equitable society, and raising the standard of living in terms of like health, nutrition, ecology, while also addressing these conventional measures of standard of living that are what we would almost like to cheer the collapse of? I'm muted myself because I'm.
Could I add something to that? Are you done, Keith? One of the things that I've been thinking about for a while is this this crisis of imagination that we are going through right now. It's a real crisis of imagination. So when I'm asking you to dream and dream big, it's like when people take our course, we ask them to not design their final presentation based on what they think the client would want or how much money, but really, like, we have to use all of our senses to dream up the world that we want to live in. And the people who are in power right now are so bereft of any kind of imagination. Like, really, is this the best that you got? I mean, I hate to tell them that, you know, their grandchildren are going to suffer. Like, there's no escape. We are on a rock in outer space. And even if we did want to go to another planet, last I checked, women still ovulate with the moon, and we are earthlings, true and true. That is it. So this struggle, this opening, I mean, people are really surprising, right? Who knew that everybody was going to want to grow their own food? Just like that. Who knew that everyone was going to be baking artisanal bread, you know? They're like, everybody's a sourdough expert now. So that gives me actually a lot of hope. And if I could leave you with anything, is really to have some hope and to meet this challenge with a bright vision of the future, because a lot of people don't know what a bright future looks like. We're really good at dystopia. We are really, really expert at creating convoluted chaos. It is very challenging for us to create this, this positive scenario. But I would say that permaculture is actually, that's one of our skills. That's one of the things that we do quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Any last thoughts? We have about 10 minutes left in the conversation. Parting words of wisdom from any of our panelists.
Okay, I know I've been talking a lot, but I just had this, people know, or maybe they don't know about enclosure, the Enclosure Act that happened in Europe where it basically created our economy. It basically created jobs. People didn't have jobs before this. If you have ever wondered how people came to get paid for work, the Enclosure Act basically kicked people out of the commons, and they had to earn money from their labor. And I was pondering on our ecological disaster that's happening in our country and around the world right now. And that is kind of like our era's enclosure, because there's land, there's underground aquifers, there's air, there's soils that are contaminated that basically people just have to stay away from. And oftentimes, as we know with fracking in Pennsylvania and other places around the country and around the world, people's lands are really, really affected, and they cannot actually earn their keep off their land. They can't raise animals, they can't raise food. Contamination is a big issue. So while we're focusing on carbon, we really need to focus on my last things that I will say: the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, but also the Farm Bill. This last Farm Bill is where the most subsidies happened for organic agriculture. We need to be absolutely clear that we want organic agriculture in no uncertain terms. I've sat on panels with people from Cornell who, when I've asked, is our goal here to make New York State completely organic? And they say, no, no, we can't grow grapes without chemicals. And my next question then would be, well, maybe we shouldn't grow grapes? Maybe we should grow them different.
Thank you, Adriana. And any last words from panelists before I kick it back to Liz to give us some important PAN announcements? Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a really amazing and interesting conversation. Bonita, you look like you have something to say.
I just wanted to say a word about gratitude. So I think, you'd mentioned before, Adriana, just our lack of creativity, how easy it is for us to create dystopian visions of the future. And I think gratitude is also it's a simple skill. And I think someone had just typed on the side, this permaculturist learning to kind of create heaven on earth, like that as a skill. And I think gratitude is part of that skill. I think it's not only knowing how to plant, not only knowing how to tend the plants and understand the landscape and listen to the plants and work with what's happening here on the land. It's also learning to be grateful for what we have. So it's basically learning also. I think there are skills of observation. There's skills of physical observation, and there's also skills of noticing what the abundance that is around us and all that is around us that supports us and that supports our lives. And I think that's a skill too, to actually be able to observe and find all of what is healing, all of what is nourishing, all of what is growing out there. So even if we look at a degraded piece of land, we can have gratitude for the weeds that are doing beautiful work. Even in communities where people are maybe without homes or without jobs, we can be grateful for the people who are stepping out as leaders and trying to organize people. And so I think one of the skills, in addition to our observation, in addition to learning, and Susie's written here, heart skills. It is heart skills. And I think it is part of our skills. It's part of our observation skills, is learning to know, learning to see and value what we have. And I think that is one of our skills as permaculturists, learning to actually see what is growing on the land that is a value, that can serve life, and what is growing in our human communities that can serve life. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonita. Great way to end our conversation here. I just wanted to thank all of you again for attending, and to all the panelists and PAN. And just to remind people that this evening has been recorded, and we had over 200 people register for this webinar. And so everyone will be getting a recording of the webinar, and please feel free to share it. If you were moved, please share it and keep in touch. I will now pass it off to Liz for some PAN announcements.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Lisa. So like Lisa mentioned, thank you so much to our wonderful speakers who have donated their time to be here this evening. The work that you're doing in all of your communities and areas is super inspiring. And we will be sending out a recording, like Lisa mentioned, to all those who registered within the next few days. And I've also been keeping track of all these resources and materials that were mentioned by our panelists, and we'll include a short list of those in the follow-up email as well, because I think there is at least between 6 to 10 resources that were mentioned, where people in the chat seemed interested in those. And then the last thing I wanted to say, just a quick little plug before we wrap up. The PAN Board of Directors is strongly committed to people, care, and social justice. And because of this, a small group of board members, as well as other PAN members, have formed an ad hoc equity committee. And the purpose of this committee is to collaborate on the creation of an equity statement to help guide the future of our organization's work for the broader permaculture network, and to create a plan to implement that statement. And so I just wanted to say, if anyone is interested in joining that committee, to please email us at info@northeastpermaculture.org, and that can also be found on our website. And that's all. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.